Hello there, I'm Jimmy Vegas. This is how to create a survival horror game in Unity, and welcome to episode 18. In this tutorial, we're going to focus on post-processing. Yes, I know, we're finally getting there with it. So the great thing about post-processing is that it makes everything look good, providing you know what you're doing. So don't forget, click the subscribe button, click the bell icon as well, stay up to date with every tutorial in this series and everything else on my channel. And with that in mind, let's get this game looking good. So, post-processing. Before we do anything, let's know where to get it from. So we go to the asset store, and when it's loaded up, depending on whether it's in the new style or old style, then, either way, we still get the post-processing from there. So if it loads up in this new style, you would just need to type up here in the search box, when it thinks about it, post-processing. And you'll see it right here, the post-processing stack by Unity Technologies. You just need to click on it. You'll notice this icon and click on import or download. And if you're on the old store, which you can easily get to just by clicking that little button there, same principle, post processing, and you just look for that same one, post processing stack from Unity Technologies. So what is post processing? Well, the idea of post processing allows you to overlay whatever is displayed through your camera to give it extra effects, things like bloom, things like ambient occlusion, things like grain. What are all these? Well, don't worry, I'll explain now. So, we have post-processing right here, but how do we get it working? What do we do? Well, there's a couple of things we're going to have to do to our editor before we can actually go any further. Otherwise, post-processing becomes kind of a little bit pointless. So the first thing we're going to want to have to do is go to Edit, go to Project Settings, and go to Quality. Now the reason we have to go to this place is because over here in Anti-Aliasing we have to change that to Disabled. All will become apparent as we go further into this tutorial. Now next thing we have to do is if we go to our FPS controller, click down to our character, that's where our camera is stored. Now to get things working properly, what we're going to have to do is change the rendering path to deferred. Now, it's worth pointing out, you'll have noticed a slight change in your scene at this point. This does kind of take up more resources, so it's more of a strain on your processor, but it does achieve better lighting, as we can kind of see here already. And with that also, it does mean that we have to disable multi-sample anti-aliasing, which is MSAA right here. You've probably got a little warning like I have. Again, all will become apparent as we go through this tutorial. Also a good idea to tick Allow HDR. Why? Well, it's a way of allowing the camera to better control the viewing of the scene when we apply the post-processing. In other words, it helps it. So we've got this all set now. How do we get this post-processing working? Well, all we need to do is go into the runtime folder in the post-processing, and we need to attach this script right here. It's called post-processing behavior, and it gets attached to whatever object a camera is on. So in this case, a camera is on the first person character. So we need to drag and drop that straight onto there. If we click it, you'll see this component right here. Nothing's changed so far, but it says profile. That means we need to create a profile for the post-processing stack. To do that, we can be in any folder, but I'm going to stay within this runtime folder. Right click, create, and down here you'll see post-processing profile. So let's click it. I'm going to create this as, let's say, JVSH, so for me, survival horror. And then you'll see this over here. So yours may look like this if you've dealt with post-processing before. If it's the first time you've ever dealt with it, it may look a little like this. Either way, it doesn't matter too much right now. So I'm going to start with my profile like this. Before we do anything, let's go to our first person character and let's drag and drop that profile onto here. So drag and drop, and there we go. Now we're ready to start playing around with our settings. So what are these settings and what do they do? So fog, default, it's not really important right now because fog is something we'll probably deal with at a later date anyway, but we can just leave that ticked. Anti-aliasing, this is why we turn things off. You can see now why we have done it. So if we tick this, we should see a slight change. It's a way of cutting out all the sharp and horrible gritty edges of any textures on the screen. And realistically, we're better off sticking with the fast approximate method, because you can see if I change it to temporal, it's going to take a little bit more strain on the processor, and it probably doesn't quite look so good. But generally, having it as the fast approximate is going to do the job just right. You can already see this section here is starting to look quite nice. Next on the list, if we click on the word, we have ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion helps light and shadows work in places that they would otherwise struggle with. For example, tight corners down here. You can see already that the ambient occlusion, even though it's not ticked, but because we have our camera set up, this is kind of ready to accept what we're going to do with ambient occlusion. And if we tick it, you'll notice the difference. You can see already how much darker it's getting down here because the light is getting kind of restricted. So if we change the intensity, let's say to 4, you can see just how much of an impact this is now having in the crevices and corners of our room right here. And obviously the radius would dictate how far this darkness spreads. If our radius was 0, it wouldn't get anywhere. If our radius was quite high, you can see how much that is getting around. Now all this is happening while I'm in scene view. So I'm going to kind of do it here for now, but I'm also going to explain why it's useful in game view as well. So I'm going to have the sample count set as medium because realistically I don't want to put too much strain on the processor unless you're really aiming for that kind of thing. But again, it's all about the quality you want. So I want to have the radius about 1, so we have at least something that we can deal with. And downsampling, again, if you untick that, you can see the kind of detail you're getting here and how it looks overall. So if I kind of move over and zoom out, you can see just how it's starting to look here. I'm going to keep downsampling ticked just to kind of free the processor up a little bit, but by all means, it's something for you to work with. And the same for the others. You know, there's no real necessity to have some of these options ticked. It just depends what you want your game to look like. So next we have screen space reflection. If we tick it, we're not going to see a whole lot. Reason being is because we don't really have that much reflective objects within the scene. So even though we have this reflection probe right here, there is no real point in us having in our profile the screen space reflection ticked. Again, it's just not that sort of environment that you would have it in. If you're in some kind of, let's say, laboratory where you've got like reflective glass floors or whatever, then yes, that will come in handy. But we'll come to that when we do create that kind of scene. So for now, there's no point in us having it in this scene. So next on the list is depth of field. Now, this isn't really going to matter too much to us because, again, it's not that sort of scene that we're going to deal with this in. But it's probably something that we'll come to eventually. But there's no harm in you playing around with it. Next, we have motion blur. Now, motion blur is a common theme you would see in most games, especially of a first-person style. So if we tick it, we can see already what kind of settings we're dealing with here. And if I press play at this point, we'll see just how the post-processing is working on our game so far. Already you can see it looking, well, better than it did when we first started. But you can see here how the motion blur is already working. So you can literally see the blur as we turn our camera. Now, I wouldn't recommend having too much motion blur because it can make you feel a little bit sick and dizzy sometimes. But by default, I've always found the motion blur to be spot on. I quite like how it comes as default, but feel free to play around with the settings, i.e. changing your sample count up and shutter angle. Now, this is a great time for me to display how things can change and stay changed. So although we've changed some settings, let's change this to 190, do it that way. Usually, if we were in the game view and made changes on settings, they would revert back to normal, as they do in scene view. However, with the post-processing, it doesn't. It remains as it is. But you can still use that Control-Z to undo and go back to your original settings. So maybe play around with motion blur just a little bit. Eye adaptation is a way of changing how you basically come from light into dark or dark into light. It's basically how your eyes would adjust in the real world. It's doing it for you in the game world. Now, there's no point in us having eye adaptation here because we're only staying in one environment. There's no light and we're pretty dark environment here, so there's no need to have that activated at this point, but it's probably something we will do further in development. Bloom. Now, this is where things get exciting because bloom, I feel, is overused quite a lot in games. However, when done right, it can look absolutely fantastic. If we click bloom, we can already see a change is occurring. Now, we can change the intensity, but it's not really going to matter too much because it's all about the threshold. If we decrease the threshold, we can see just how stupid, let's be honest, how stupid that looks. However, with the right kind of settings, we can give it a look which may be unique. Maybe you're going for something like that, but already you can see how the bloom is affected by what we're seeing here. Well, this is a good opportunity to see the ambient occlusion in effect as well, because we can see it in these corners. Now, this is probably not a sensible way of dealing with what we have here. It's not sensible at all. So working with bloom can be difficult, but never ever overdo it with bloom because it will look ridiculous. So the intensity obviously dictates how intense your bloom effect is going to be. The threshold dictates when and where, basically. You'll have this little graph here and you can see just how much of an impact what you're doing is having. You can play around with the softening. Again, that all depends on the size and how much bloom you want it to be. So basically, it makes the lighter pixels really shine, makes the darker pixels kind of as they are. And obviously the radius would be the radius, the size of what you want. So you can always play around with these settings. Let's try intensity of 10. Let's try a threshold of, let's try 0.9. And obviously we're going to want anti-flicker because we don't want flickering to happen. What this basically means is that when you're looking at a light, you might get a horrible little flicker just every now and again just because of how the bloom is taking effect. We need to decrease the softening. Probably quite a lot, I would say. Oh yeah, I forgot. You can always do that. Just hover over and it'll give you little notes of what things mean. But you can basically see what that means. So this is going to be quite low, I think. So let's try 0.35 maybe. And the radius, let's try half of that. So 3.6 maybe. Now you're not going to see too much of a difference right now. However, this is where the next one comes into play. So if we close up bloom and go on to color grading, when we tick it, you're not going to see much, but changing the tone mapper from neutral to filmic will start making a difference. Now the post exposure is what makes the biggest difference, as we can see here. We want it to look kind of cool, but we don't want it to look ridiculous, but we don't want it to look completely dark. So finding the right exposure level here is probably best. And you can see here, it literally tells you the overall exposure of the scene, right? So let's have this as maybe 4. Okay, so we're getting there. The temperature dictates, basically, you'll be able to see, it kind of sets the balance of the whitish. So you can see the more we go, it kind of gives it that warm, eerie look. But if you go low, it gives it a dark, cold, creepy look. So I've always found either having it just as the standard, which is 0, or a little bit lower or a little bit higher. So I'm going to go just a little bit higher, maybe 9. We'll try 9. Tint, again, this is, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's just playing with the colors, as you can see. Kind of like a disco going on there. So I'm going to leave this as 0. Same with the hue shift. There's no point playing with that because I'm happy with the color I'm dealing with in the game. Saturation, again, it's dealing with colors and it's kind of adding to how it feels. So you can see that deep saturation color happening there. But taking it away gives a black and white feel. So again, because this is a survival horror, it all depends on what you want to do and how you want it all to look. So I'm going to have saturation set as a little bit higher than usual, so probably 1.2-ish. And the contrast, well, yet again with colour, you can see how much of an impact that has. Having it at 0, not a good idea, you barely see anything. So in my opinion, you're always best either at 1 or a little bit higher than 1. So let's try 1.5 and let's see how that pans out. So the channel mixer, I'm not going to go into, but you basically can change how the colouring mixes with your red, green and blue. You could literally spend hours trying to work with this and making it look kind of cool. So maybe it is something for you to play around with, but it's all about changing the colour and how the style looks. So the next thing I'm going to play around with is, in fact, what I'm going to play around with is the grain next, but I'll explain what the LUT is. So the user LUT is basically something that's created in an external program for colour grading. So rather than play around with all the colour grading, you just use the LUT. Chromatic Aberration. It's a weird one. If you have played Resident Evil Revelations 2 and know what a glasp is, you will see how this has an effect. If I change it to 1, you can already see up here and down here the kind of weird effect that's going on, and that's probably useful for a survival horror. It's kind of like a focus kind of thing, and I guess you could use it if you want to, but it's entirely up to you. I'm going to tick grain on this because I want it to have that weird kind of grain effect, and you can see already if I change the intensity how it's having an effect on the screen. Size, again, you can have it really deep and really grainy, but again, I found the general kind of default view to be kind of cool. You could always turn off color just so you get the basically black and white kind of feel. And the last one I'm going to deal with is Vignette. Tick it, and it basically darkens around the outside. And if I press play now, again, it kind of gives a focus feel of how the game looks and plays out. So I guess you could always play around with it. If you turn it off, we should see a difference. But you don't want it to focus, because too focus means it's too much. Like you can see the intensity there. It's focused on one point. And again, I feel like that the default settings for it are fairly decent. And I can already see that our grain is just a little bit too much, so I'm going to tone it down just a little, probably to about there. And let's see how this game pans out now. So you can see already how much different this game now looks. We can see that there's not particularly a problem as such, but the lighting can be a little bit bad. Okay, so we've basically created our own settings here for post-processing, and there is a lot more to it. We've given it that dark, eerie look, but you don't necessarily have to. For example, you could change the saturation down a little bit, temperature down a little bit. You could change the bloom, intensity higher, a lower threshold. I guess it's all up to you, really, because it's your game. It's not mine. I'm showing you how you can build it, build the mechanics. So one thing I would recommend if you're going for the exact same settings that I have is increasing light. Light is not hard to deal with, but if we tick light on here, we're not going to see too much of an impact that we would hope, just because of the way we've had this set up. If we change the intensity, all that's going to do is change the bloom, as we can see here. It just looks absolutely insane. But that is because it is a directional light. So if you do have problems with light, changing the main light source, in this case the directional light, isn't going to make a difference. What you would need to do is change the lighting that is within the scene itself. So for example, if we go to create up here, where it's got in the hierarchy, next to it the little search bar, type in light, and what I'm going to do is take those torch illumination lights, and I could theoretically change the intensity, and you can see how much of an effect bloom is having on those. So maybe it's something we could do. I guess it's something we could change with the strenuous lighting. So I guess we could set it to 5 maybe, and set the range maybe to 10. That's a bit much, isn't it, guys? So maybe set it as 7. Press play, and let's just see how this looks. Okay, so kind of a different look among the game now. Still dark, so it's probably something that we're going to have to deal with. So it's kind of, it is definitely giving the survival horror feel to it. So let's take the profile now and let's see what happens if we change our bloom. So let's try changing our intensity quite high. You can see what it's doing to the lights. So if we undo, let's add our radius. Yep, okay, so that's giving it a nice kind of feel. Softening, we should be able to see what happens now. So I couldn't really display it before just because of the style of scene we were in, but changing it really brings that out. And I guess we could change the threshold gamma to 0.8. In fact, maybe 0.5. You can see that's probably too much, so maybe keep it as 0.9. And again, this is where the color grading also has an effect. If we change this to 6, you can see just how much it illuminates the scene, but if we change it to 1, again you can see what's happening. So all I could recommend at this point is playing around with the settings that we've discussed here and kind of work on how you feel your game should be looking. Like I say, it's your game, not mine. Do you need to change the temperature up high? Go low? Do you need to change the contrast down a little bit? Give it that kind of creepy look, saturation. Play with all these things and it'll be amazing what you can come up with. Ambient occlusion. Change the radius. Not too much, but you can see how much of an impact it's having in the corners of the room. So I'm going to leave mine like that, although it looks a little bit crazy. When we press play, it doesn't look as bad. So yeah, that's not too bad. So I'll stick with how that looks for now. One last thing in regards to post-processing. If you're using a version of Unity that is not Unity 5, by default you'll see all this post-processing occur in the scene view. If this slows your scene down, just need to click here, this little image on the list, and make sure you untick image effects, and you'll just be presented with the bare minimum of what your scene would look like. You can see it's just the textures, the materials, and the lights. That's all you would see. However, in the game view, you would see it as you've already done with your post-processing. So that's why sometimes it's best to do your post-processing in game view. So guys, next tutorial, what we're going to do is we are going to take a look at creating some voice acting, and we're also going to deal with layers because I'm sure I've said it before, as you can see the gun kind of clips through things, so we're going to stop that happening with layers. So guys, until the next tutorial, thank you very much for watching.